blizzard wind ripped the rope from Silas Carrow's fist. A man was dying, and Tahnee had sworn she would save this ranch or lose everything trying, and out past the barn in a whiteout swallowing the whole valley, she was the only one who could still find him. It began 5 months earlier, on a smoke-filled September afternoon, with a stranger standing in a doorway asking for nothing more than a place by the fire. Milk burned black on the stove that day. Smoke curled along the rafters of Stone Creek Ranch, thick enough to sting the eyes, while one infant screamed against Silas's shoulder and the other clawed at his shirt collar. Here stood a man who could drag a full-grown steer out of a bog with his bare hands, undone by 2 frightened children he could not quiet for even a single breath. The stranger in the doorway watched only a moment before she moved. Tahnee had come to Stone Creek for water, directions, one night's shelter, before the true cold of the high country settled in. Instead, she found a widowed rancher, losing a fight that no amount of strength could win. "May I?" Already her arms were reaching. Silas hesitated a single heartbeat. Then the little girl was in Tahnee's hands. She lifted the baby against her chest, cradled the small head into the curve of her neck, and carried her out onto the porch, low words falling steady the whole way. The crying thinned, then stopped completely. Silas stared from his suddenly sleeping daughter to the boy still red-faced in his own arms, and something in his face cracked open. "What is it you want?" was all he could manage. Tahnee's eyes moved past him. The smoke, the fields fading gold into gray, the first true smell of winter riding down off the ridge, a place by the fire, and food at the table. No bargain got struck that evening. He only stepped back and let her in, and the letting in came not from trust, but from the bone-deep exhaustion of a man who'd been fighting alone far too long. If this story is pulling you in, tap join beside the channel name and become a member. It's a small way to help keep frontier stories like this one coming. She had ridden into a country that did not forgive carelessness, and she knew it the way her father had known it before her, and his mother before him. The wind that came down off that ridge in September was only a warning of the wind that would come in January, and she read it the same way she read the color of a sunset, or the tightness in a horse's ears before thunder, not as a mystery, but as a language her people had spent generations learning to speak fluently. Stone Creek sat higher than most ranches in the valley, closer to the timber line, closer to the first true snow, and she understood before she ever set down her bundle that this house would need more than firewood to survive what was coming. Stone Creek Ranch had not broken down overnight. It had been wearing thin for 10 quiet months. Ruth Carrow died when the twins were barely 3 months old, a fever that at first looked no worse than any she'd shaken off before. The nearest doctor lived half a day's ride out, and Silas waited 1 day too long before sending for him. By the time help reached the ranch, there was nothing left to save. Afterward, Silas became father, mother, rancher, carpenter, and bookkeeper all in one. Worn through body, the twins were fed. Little more got done than that. The north bedroom stayed locked. Ruth's handwritten labels still hung untouched from the food bins in the cellar. Fires burned through too much wood because empty rooms stayed heated out of old habit. Nobody had the strength to break. More nights than not found Silas asleep upright in a chair, one baby dozing on his chest, the fire dying behind him. A silence like that was one Tahnee understood better than most. Her own husband had died 2 years earlier, crushed beneath an overturned wagon on a logging road, and afterward she worked a homestead until the family who owned it sold the land out from under her. She'd arrived at Stone Creek with almost nothing and no certain place left to go. Neither of them had found the other by accident. Life had simply left both of them with nowhere else to turn. She still carried her husband's memory the way a person carries a stone in a coat pocket, not heavy enough to slow the walking, but present in every reach of the hand. 2 winters had passed since the wagon rolled, since men she barely knew dug a grave and ground too cold to want to open. and in those 2 winters she had learned that grief did not need to be spoken of to be honored. It needed only to be carried well. Watching Silas move through his own house, like a man half buried under a weight he refused to name, she recognized the shape of it instantly because she had worn that same shape herself not so long before. Silas didn't accept her offer right away. "What do you know about raising children?" His first real question, wary, watching her hands the whole time. She claimed nothing more than the truth, caring for babies on isolated homesteads, helping her own mother through hard births, a father who'd taught her to read hunger and cold and trouble breathing in a small face long before any of it turned dangerous. It was knowledge carried through hard winters by her people, longer than this ranch had stood on its foundations. "I can't pay you," he warned. "I'm not asking for wages," came her answer. "A roof, a warm meal, a place that wouldn't turn her back out before the snow closed the road. Fresh milk went to the twins within the hour. She changed them, washed their small faces, settled them side by side in a wider cradle. The boy fussed a while. The girl slept almost at once. Watching her finish one task before starting the next decided something in Silas that he couldn't have put into words. "If the children don't settle, or if you give me one reason not to trust you, you leave before the first heavy snow." Those were his only terms, and she took every one of them without argument. He gave her the small room off the kitchen. The papers, the north bedroom, the barn, ledger, off limits. She only nodded. It was not so different from other arrangements she'd made in the 2 hard years since her husband died. A room in exchange for work, a place at a table in exchange for hands that never stopped moving. What was different was the weight in the man's eyes when he handed her his daughter, a weight that had nothing to do with distrust and everything to do with a grief so heavy it had crushed the words right out of him. She had seen that particular weight only once before, in her own mirror, in the year after the wagon rolled, and she recognized it the way a traveler recognizes a landmark from an old, hard road. That first night she lay awake listening to wind slip through the walls the way water moves through a woven basket, finding every gap left unmended. Before sunrise she was up to find the fire burned to ash and 3 empty rooms still standing open, quietly pulling what warmth remained toward the cold outside. The twins slept in cradles clear across the room from the stove, cold air crawling the floorboards toward them while they dreamed. Every morning the little girl woke with the same faint cough. Tahnee didn't start by chasing drafts through the walls. She changed how the family lived inside the house. Instead, the table moved closer to the stove. The cradles followed. Old blankets went up over simple wooden poles, closing a smaller winter room where a still layer of air could gather between cloth and wall unused. Rooms shut. Rolled cloth blocked the gaps beneath their doors. Silas came home to have his house rearranged without his say-so, and rather than argue, he watched her set 2 pots of warm water down, one inside the new room, one just past the hanging blankets. 4 hours later, only the inside pot still held heat. 4 days later, the wood pile lasted longer, and both twins slept deeper than they had in weeks. Silas never once praised the work. He simply left everything exactly where she'd put it, and the silence carried its own answer. There was a name for what she'd built, though she never spoke it aloud in that house, a small warm pocket carved out of a cold world, the same principle her grandmother had used inside a hide lodge on the worst nights of the worst winters, where the space that mattered was never the whole shelter, but the little breathing room closest to the bodies that needed to survive. Until morning, heat was not something to be thrown at a house and hoped for. It was something to be gathered, held, and spent with care, the same way water was gathered and spent on a dry mesa. Silas had spent 10 months burning wood at a house too large for 2 grieving hearts and 2 small bodies to fill with warmth. Tahnee had simply made the house smaller where it counted. One winter room alone could not defeat a high country winter, and the cold went looking for new ground to test. Cold air still circled beneath the cradles even inside the closed-off space, so Tahnee built something smaller still. Pine boards pulled from an old shipping crate, worn wool felt, clean straw packed into cloth, sacks framed into a three-sided sleeping box open at the top. That first night the boy slept longer than he had in a month. By morning, the felt lining pressed damp beneath her palm. The twins' own breath had gotten trapped inside with nowhere to go. Half the frame came apart before breakfast was even on the table. "So it doesn't work," Silas observed from the doorway. "It doesn't work yet," was the only answer he got. Before the front panel dropped lower, two narrow vents opened near the top, the damp lining got replaced, and the whole frame moved farther from the stove so heat would spread evenly instead of pooling. That second night the felt got checked 3 separate times. By morning it was dry, and the little girl never coughed once. Watching the discarded board stacked against the wall, Silas understood something about the woman under his roof. She cared far more about the children than she ever cared about being right the first time around. Cooking breakfast one morning, Tahnee found a potato with a long white sprout, curling toward the light. It was never just one potato. Onions felt damp beneath their skins. Squash carried small patches of mold near the stems. Apples stacked too close had let one bruised fruit spoil 4 of its neighbors. Cornmeal had hardened into heavy lumps, and a sack of dried beans against the cellar wall carried a faint sour smell that had no business being there. My grandfather lived through worse winters than this one. Silas argued from the cellar steps. Tahnee cut the potato open to show him the pale flesh already breaking beneath the sprout, then lifted a storage crate to show the dark, moisture-stained boards underneath. Tied to the bins in careful handwriting sat 3 small labels. "Use first, keep dry, for the babies." She wiped the dust from the words but left every letter untouched, adding only her inspection date on the back. Everything spoiled came out at once. Everything sound got sorted by how long it would last. Watching the pile grow outside the cellar door, Silas stiffened. "You're throwing away our winter." "Winter started taking it long before I opened that door," was the whole of her reply. Nothing got stored the same way twice. Potatoes went into shallow layers in the dark, unwashed. Onions and garlic hung where the air stayed dry. Carrots and turnips went into barely damp sand, trimmed clean. Squash rested on wooden slats instead of the cold floor. Sound apples got wrapped one by one so no bruise could spread. Cornmeal and dried beans moved into covered chests raised off the ground. That same afternoon, Reuben Hale, an old ranch hand who'd worked every spread in the valley for 30 years, stopped by to mend a broken gate and found Tahnee hauling storage bins away from the wall. He nearly laughed at her, nearly told her the cellar had outlasted plenty of winters without anyone fussing over it, until she lifted a crate to show him the wet wood underneath. His own hand touched it. Nothing more got said. Instead, he helped her raise slotted shelves and narrow walkways between the bins. A few days on, Tahnee found her own mistake. The sand around the carrots had gone too wet, and several roots had turned slick near the tops. Out came the box, every spoiled root discarded, the sand dried, the rest packed again without complaint. "Going to hide that from Silas," Reuben teased. "Food doesn't care who's right," came her reply, while she brushed the dirt from her hands. "It only keeps spoiling while pride argues about it." Her own father had shown her the same lesson years before, kneeling beside a cache pit dug into dry ground, teaching her to read a root the way another man might read a brand on a steer, the give of the skin, the smell at the cut, the weight of it in the palm. Nothing in that lesson had ever mentioned pride. It had only ever been about the difference between a family eating through February and a family going hungry in February. And that difference lived in small, unglamorous choices made in October, long before anyone was hungry enough to notice them. She carried that lesson into Ruth's cellar, the same way she carried it everywhere else, quietly, without ceremony, simply doing the next necessary thing. By the second week, the whole house had settled into a new rhythm. Dawn found her checking the sleeping box, coaxing the fire back to life, cooking soft cornmeal porridge for the twins, before Silas was even awake. With the children fed and settled, he could spend a full morning mending fences, instead of racing back to the house every hour. Reuben no longer had to drop his tools to rock a crying baby. The boy had started pulling himself upright against a chair leg. The girl's cough had all but disappeared. One afternoon, Silas came in from the pasture and stopped outside the winter room because he heard laughter, real laughter, the kind this house hadn't held in months. A wooden spoon vanished beneath Tahnee's apron, then reappeared, and the boy burst into delighted giggles every single time. His sister watched him one long heartbeat before joining in. It was the first time Silas had heard both his children laugh since Ruth died, and he stood in the doorway a long moment just to keep hearing it. Some evenings after that, once the porridge pot was scraped clean and the fire banked low, Tahnee hummed the twins to sleep with a lullaby her own mother had once sung over her, the words older than the ranch, older than the territory line drawn across her people's country. That carrying a rhythm the twins seemed to feel in their small chests before they ever understood a syllable of it. Silas never asked what the words meant. He only noticed that both children slept easier on the nights. She sang it, and that was answer enough for a man who had run out of most other kinds of answers months before. Not long after, the little girl crawled into the hallway and pressed her small hand flat against the locked north bedroom door. Tahnee never reached for the handle. She only wondered aloud whether a heavier blanket might be somewhere inside for the babies. Silas stood outside that door a long time that night, saying nothing to anyone. Morning found the key sitting on the kitchen table without a word, and him already gone out to the barn. When they finally went in together, Tahnee let him step through first. The north bedroom looked as though time itself had stopped the day Ruth died. Her shawl still hung behind the door. A pair of sewing scissors rested beside a spool of thread, exactly where she'd left them. Folded across the foot of the bed lay a wool blanket, its border only half finished. The needle still threaded through the last stitch. Dust covered everything, but nothing inside had been disturbed. Tahnee never touched Ruth's clothes. Only after the smallest nod from Silas did she lift the unfinished blanket into her arms. On the bedside table sat a small notebook, and inside it Ruth had carefully tracked the family's weekly use of flour, dried beans, potatoes, firewood, lamp oil, even which of the hardiest potatoes to hold back as seed for spring, a clean line drawn between what the winter needed and what next year's harvest would need. Tahnee read the pages without carrying the notebook out of the room, and though blank pages still waited inside it, she closed it gently and left it exactly where it lay. Her own hand had no wish to crowd the last words Ruth left behind. Outside the kitchen she hung a small slate board instead, weekly firewood, lamp oil used, days of flour remaining. Nothing more than that. Ruth's system kept breathing without one thing disturbed that had come before her. She always said, "A house didn't need more things in it," Silas murmured, watching the board go up. "Only everything sitting in the right place." "She was right," Tahnee said softly. For the first time since her arrival at Stone Creek, Ruth stopped being spoken of only as the woman who had died, and became instead the woman who had built something worth keeping alive. That evening, Tahnee tucked the unfinished blanket over both twins, carefully turning the loose, unstitched edge inward so it would never brush against their skin. By early November, the west wind had found every weakness the house still carried. Each cold morning, a thin ring of frost formed around the nail heads driven through the north wall. Both nails, once touched, ran colder than the wood around them. With no lumber left to raise a second wall, Tahnee turned instead to a stack of dry hay bales that had lost too much color to feed the pregnant cows, but were still clean and sound, stacking them outside the windward wall, with a narrow gap of air between hay and cabin. Flatstones lifted the lowest bales clear of the ground, and a worn canvas sheet angled to shed melting snow instead of soaking it in, covered the top of the stack. Garrett Poole, a neighboring rancher riding by that same afternoon to talk cattle prices, stared at the strange wall and laughed outright. Looked like she was feeding the house instead of the cows. Silas gave him nothing back. 3 days later, Tahnee found one corner stacked too low, meltwater already darkening the bottom bale, and without a word of argument she pulled 3 bales apart, raised the stone base higher, rebuilt the corner properly. Garrett rode past again before the week was out. Told you the whole notion was foolish, he pushed. A hammer answered him instead. 2 matched iron nails driven into opposite sides of the cabin, one behind the hay wall, one on the bare exposed wood. The next freezing morning, the sheltered nail carried only the faintest trace of frost. The exposed one glittered white with it. Nobody had to point it out. Silas noticed entirely on his own, and that evening carried a fresh load of flat stones over, setting them beside her work without being asked. Apology never quite reached his mouth, but for the first time he built instead of standing off to the side, watching. She had seen walls like it before, though never built from hay bales, brush, windbreaks raised on the open plain by women who understood that the wind, not the cold itself, was usually what killed. Cold, that simply sat still, could be dressed against, waited out, endured. Cold that moved, that found every seam in a coat or a wall and forced its way through, was a different animal entirely, and breaking its path before it ever reached the people inside was worth more than any amount of wood thrown on a fire after the fact. Garrett saw a woman stacking feed against a house. Tahnee saw a wind that hadn't arrived yet, already being told no. The first snowfall came early that year, melted under 2 thin days of sunshine, then froze solid hard when the cold dropped back in. Old snow clung to the shallow kitchen roof, and fresh snow settled right on top of it instead of sliding clear. Tahnee noticed the signs before anyone else. Roof beams answering the cold with soft creaks at night. A pantry door that always swung free, starting to scrape the floor, dust shaking loose from the joints above the stove with every hard gust. That roof carried 18 winders, Silas said over his coffee, barely glancing up. It'll carry 1 more. Reuben helped instead, building a long snow rake, 2 straight lodgepole poles, a light crosspiece, a rope brace, and standing safely on the ground, the 2 of them pulled the old hardened snow away a little at a time, never stripping one side bare before touching the other, so the weight came off evenly. Silas frowned at half a morning spent fixing something that hadn't failed yet. A finger pointed toward the pantry door, then toward the faint dip beside the stovepipe. "The roof is speaking," was the whole explanation. "We just haven't learned to listen to it." Work continued until the hardened lower layers were gone, and by the next afternoon the pantry door barely rubbed the floor at all. "She isn't clearing that roof out of fear of winter," Reuben told Silas, brushing snow from his gloves. "She's clearing it because the timber already started answering the load." Silas looked up at rafters he'd raised with his own 2 hands years before, and understood for the first time that a roof doesn't wait until it collapses to say something is wrong. Sometimes it whispers first, and the wise ones listen while there's still time left to. One evening, gathering firewood together, Tahnee told him about a ranch hand her own family had once known, a man caught barely 60 yards from his own barn when a whiteout swallowed the valley whole, walking in circles until the cold finished what the storm had started. He knew every inch of that ranch. He simply couldn't see any of it. The next morning, she proposed a guide rope stretched from the back porch to the woodshed, then on again to the barn. "No one gets lost in their own yard," Silas argued, shaking his head. "Could you find the barn with your eyes closed?" she asked back, "with wind driving snow straight into your face?" He had no answer for that. Reuben helped drive tall lodgepole stakes into the frozen ground, and the rope got tied at waist height, knotted at wide intervals so a gloved hand could count each one blind. A second line branched toward the woodshed. Every stake stood well above the deepest snow they usually expected. "Looks like Stone Creek needs a leash," Garrett laughed, riding by while they worked. Tahnee only kept pulling the rope taut. A week later, heavy fog rolled over the ranch before sunrise, and finishing his chores, Reuben reached for the guide rope and followed it home, stepping onto the porch to realize he'd drifted a full 12 paces off the invisible path before his hand ever found the line. That evening, Silas tested it himself, walking porch to barn in full dark with one gloved hand riding the rope the whole way. "A middle post needs another brace," was the only thing he came back saying. Tahnee tied a strip of faded cloth, torn from her own dress, around the first knot nearest the porch, so that even in full darkness, home would always have a beginning a hand could find. Distance in open snow country was a trick the eyes played on a person long before the cold ever finished the job, and she had grown up hearing the stories that proved it. Riders found frozen an arm's length from a door they never saw. Children lost between a house and a well they could have walked to blind on any ordinary day. A rope strung low and true was not a leash. It was a promise that no matter how completely the world went white, one true line back to warmth would always exist, waiting only to be found by a gloved and searching hand. The first week of December brought a closed carriage instead of more snow. Seeing the two small trunks strapped behind it, Silas understood exactly why his late wife's mother had come before she ever stepped down onto the porch. Adelaide Crane had buried her daughter 10 months earlier and had no intention of losing her grandchildren as well. Straight to the twins she went, without greeting anyone first, hands checked, faces checked, the sound of their breathing checked. She watched them eat. She examined their neatly mended clothes with a sharp, practiced eye. That night she stood quietly outside the winter room until both children fell asleep without a single cough between them. Only then did she turn toward Tahnee. "Do you believe you've become their mother?" she pressed. "No," came the answer. "Without hesitation, they already have one. Her name is written all over this house. If you want more stories like Tahnee and Silas's, tap join beside the channel name. Becoming a member is a quiet way to support what we're building here." Down into the cellar Adelaide went next, and found Ruth's handwriting still on every label, inspection dates added neatly to the back without one word crossed over the original. Potatoes, onions, squash, dried beans, seed potatoes for spring, all of it sorted with care she couldn't fault. She was searching for proof that Tahnee had erased her daughter's place in this house and found none of it. She found Ruth's work still breathing instead. It changed nothing about her decision. After Christmas, she told Silas plainly, the twins would leave with her. Respect had been earned in this house. Respect, she understood, was not the same thing as family. Watching the two small trunks beside the carriage, large enough to carry away everything her twins owned, something in Tahnee's chest went very still and very quiet. That evening, Adelaide asked Silas out onto the back porch, and the wind carried most of their words away, though not quite all of them. "You've replaced Ruth too quickly," she accused. "You've brought a stranger into my daughter's home." Silas answered the way he always had, out of habit, more than conviction. "Tahnee is only here temporarily." The words left his mouth and landed wrong, sounding less like caution now than plain cowardice. Through the kitchen window he could see Tahnee folding the twins' small clothes while the boy leaned his whole weight against her leg trying to stand. "No, that isn't true anymore." Adelaide waited, silent, in the cold. She didn't replace Ruth. Ruth built this home, organized every shelf in that cellar, filled every bin and every room with care nobody else could have managed. Tahnee hadn't erased one bit of that. His eyes moved toward the barn, then back to the lit windows of the house. "She's the reason any of it is still alive." A long moment passed while Adelaide studied his face in the dark. "Do you love her?" came the question at last. "Or do you only need her?" He never answered the one she'd actually asked. "If Tahnee leaves, was his answer instead. "I won't just lose someone who watches my children. I'll lose the only person who's ever looked at Stone Creek like it was a family and not a list of chores waiting to be finished." Inside, only fragments reached Tahnee. Through the thin wall, still alive, a family, and the small shirt she'd been folding lowered in her hands while she stood very still, listening. That night, Adelaide agreed to stay through the coming storms before taking the children anywhere. When the house finally went quiet, Silas found Tahnee standing by the stove. "I should have spoken up when Garrett mocked you," he admitted. "I was wrong not to." Her eyes stayed steady on him. "If you truly want me here, stop calling it temporary the moment someone else is listening." Back to folding the children's clothes she went, and this time laid them carefully into the drawer instead of leaving them packed inside her travel bag by the door. By the last week of January, the whole valley had gone strangely quiet. The barometer dropped low and stayed there. Horses turned their backs to the western ridge hours before any wind arrived. Small birds vanished off the fences one by one. Even the creek seemed to hush itself. Then the wind stopped altogether, and for nearly half a day, nothing at all moved across the land. That stillness worried Tahnee more than any storm she'd ever ridden through. Late that evening, a pale ring formed around the moon, and every system on the ranch got checked one final time. The old hardened snow had already come off the roof. The guide rope stood tight between every post. The winter room had drawn in even smaller to hold less air to warm. Smooth river stone sat beside the stove, slowly gathering heat for the night ahead. The calf warming crate stood, lined fresh with burlap. Bundles of cottonwood branches, willow twigs, dried corn stalks hung inside the barn as emergency fodder. Potatoes, squash, dried beans, cornmeal got counted once more. Belle, one of the older cows, stood close to calving. "Garrett stopped by before riding home for the night. Town says it'll just be another heavy snow, nothing more," and waved off the offer to move his youngest calves into better shelter. Why prepare for a disaster that hasn't even arrived? Adelaide wondered, watching Tahnee move from one task to the next without pause. "Storms don't give people time to prepare," was the answer. One final knot pulled tight into the guide rope. "They only reveal who already had it." Ready before sunset, Silas asked Reuben to stay the night, then turned toward Tahnee, and for the first time since her arrival at Stone Creek, the question wasn't whether she was certain of anything. What did we miss? He wanted to know instead. Her eyes moved west toward the horizon, and before an answer could form, the wind changed direction all at once. The storm broke a little after midnight. The first gust hit the north wall like a falling tree. Then another came behind it, and another after that. Powder snow forced itself into every crack it could find. Before dawn, the windows had vanished completely behind solid white, and Stone Creek Ranch no longer had a horizon at all. The cabin groaned under the weight of it, but the hay wall took the worst of the windward side, and frost never touched the sheltered nails the way it bit into the exposed wood on the far wall. Inside the winter room, the small pocket of warmth still held around the twins. The sleeping box stayed dry. The vents Tahnee had cut carried their breath away, without stealing back the heat. Only the fire itself needed constant feeding. The wind found every seam the hay wall had not already sealed, and screamed through it like something alive, and the whole cabin answered with groans that came up through the floorboards and into the soles of the feet. Adelaide sat close to the stove with a twin in each arm, her face gone pale in the lamplight, listening to a storm unlike anything she had weathered in her sheltered years in town. Tahnee moved room to room without hurry, checking the door seals, the felt lining, the small charcoal-marked tally of wood remaining, because panic solved nothing a steady hand hadn't already solved hours before. Calm, she had learned long ago, was not the absence of fear. It was simply fear that had already done its planning and now had nothing left to do but work. One gloved fist wrapped around the guide rope, Reuben fought his way out toward the woodshed, and within a few steps the cabin vanished entirely behind blowing snow. Without that rope, nothing would have been left to follow home. The kitchen roof took the fresh snow without complaint, the old dead weight already gone days before. The rafters still creaked. They did not sag. Out in the barn, Belle went down onto her knees. Her calf was coming. Silas and Reuben disappeared into the whiteout together, one hand gripping the rope the whole way, the other shielding their faces from the wind. Nearly an hour passed before the rope trembled 3 times against Tahnee's palm. Their signal: dry cloth. Hot water. Warm river stones went into heavy towels packed beneath a low wooden sled, the heat never once touching the children directly, and Ruth's unfinished blanket settled over both twins where they slept. "We can't take the babies out into that," Adelaide protested, gripping the doorframe. "If the fire fails, one person cannot protect both the house and the barn at once." An answer, and already a bare hand was reaching for the guide rope. One brief, breath-held hesitation later, Adelaide's own hand settled behind Tahnee's on the line. The path outside had disappeared entirely. The rope had not. Belle's labor stretched on far longer than anyone wanted. By the time the calf finally slid free onto the straw, the cow was spent, and the little heifer lay still, coat soaked through, breath coming in weak, uneven pulls. Every time the barn door opened, another blast of wind-driven snow swept across the floor. Silas had wrenched his shoulder, helping Belle through the worst of it, but he kept working anyway, no complaint offered. Tahnee pointed toward the warming crate they'd built together weeks before, floor raised above the frozen ground, dry burlap lining every side, warm water crocks wrapped in heavy cloth waiting beneath the bedding, small vents near the top to let the damp air escape without stealing the warmth. Dry her first. Nothing else mattered until the water was gone from her coat. Adelaide knelt in the straw beside the calf, rubbing her down with coarse towels until the wet hair fluffed instead of clinging flat to the skin. Reuben stayed close beside Belle, murmuring low while replacing her fodder from the emergency store. Silas kept changing the burlap in the crate every time moisture collected inside it. An hour passed with no change. Then the calf came out for a few brief moments, guided close enough for Belle to smell her, to lick her, before returning to the warmth again before her small body could lose too much heat. The crate was never meant to replace her mother. It was only ever meant to buy her enough time to find her own strength. Outside the barn walls the storm had not softened at all, and every gust rattled the loose boards near the loft like something testing for a way in. Twice the lamp guttered low enough to nearly die, and twice Silas cupped a hand around the flame until it steadied again, unwilling to lose the only light they had left in a night that had already taken so much from so many. Nobody in that barn spoke of fear. There simply wasn't room for it. Beside the work still left to do outside, snow piled hard against the side door. Inside, the older cattle worked steadily through the cottonwood branches and dried corn stalks, stored weeks earlier, the best hay saved back for Belle alone. Nearly 2 hours after the birth, the little calf finally tucked her legs beneath herself, struggled up, stood trembling one single heartbeat, then collapsed gently against her mother's shoulder. "You saved her," Silas breathed out. "We only kept her alive long enough for her to start saving herself," came the correction. Adelaide's hand rested steady beneath the calf's small head, the same steady touch Tahnee had once used the day the little girl finally stopped crying months before. The storm ran into its second day. Visibility shrunk down to nearly nothing. Then the guide rope jerked hard against the porch post, once, twice, and stayed pulled taut. Heavy coats went on fast, and Silas and Reuben stepped straight back into the whiteout, one hand wrapped around the rope the whole way out. Garrett they found clinging to the middle post, barely able to keep his own feet under him. 3 young calves huddled against his legs beneath a blanket gone stiff with ice. His barn beam had given way. His water trough had vanished under the drift entirely, He'd tried reaching Stone Creek by memory alone, and memory had failed him completely. The rope had not, the same rope he'd once called a leash, doing exactly the one thing Tahnee had built it to do, finding a dying man in a white that swallowed everything else whole. Back they led him and his 3 calves, one careful step at a time, and inside the barn he saw with his own eyes everything he'd once mocked, still doing exactly the job it was built to do. The roof still stood. The barn door still swung open. Belle's newborn calf was alive and nursing. The emergency fodder was already feeding the herd through the worst of it. The hay wall had kept the whole north side of the cabin free of hard frost. And the rope he'd once called a leash had become the only road left standing in the entire valley. No one asked Garrett for an apology. A mug of warm water got pressed into his hands instead, and a quiet word sent Reuben off for more dry burlap. In the kitchen, supper simmered from vegetables sorted weeks before, potatoes marked, use first, winter squash, dried beans, cornmeal, feeding one more exhausted rancher, and 3 frightened calves besides. Garrett studied the small slate board hanging beside the cellar door. How long will the food hold out? He wanted to know. Long enough, if nobody wastes it, was the whole reply. For the first time since arriving at Stone Creek that autumn, Garrett simply nodded and offered nothing back. He sat by the fire watching the frost-rimed guide rope disappear out through the doorway, unable quite to meet Tahnee's eyes. The wind finally died after 3 long days and 2 nights without letting up. Daylight found Stone Creek buried under snow nearly to its window sills, but the cabin held firm. Not one child had suffered from smoke or cold. The cattle were exhausted, but alive, Belle peacefully nursing her calf in the corner. Down in the cellar, the food supply remained perfectly intact. Every single preparation had faced the winter's worst test and held. Rather than rush straight out to inspect the damage, Adelaide stood a long, quiet moment watching the twins sleep soundly, tucked beneath Ruth's unfinished blanket and warmed by the smooth river stones wrapped so carefully the night before. 2 women, one from the past and one standing in the present, had shielded these children together through the worst the storm could throw. On the table that morning, a hot breakfast came from the very supplies Ruth had once labeled and Tahnee had faithfully preserved through the whole long winter. Warmth from the stove settled over Silas, over Reuben, over one once arrogant neighbor with nowhere else left to be. The house hadn't merely survived winter's worst. It had bound every one of them together into something that finally looked like family, a place where nobody got left out in the cold. Standing beside the stove, Adelaide turned to Silas first. "I won't be taking Caleb and Josephine with me." Then to Tahnee, "I came here believing you meant to erase my daughter's memory from this house." Her fingers touched the edge of the wool blanket gently. "Now I understand you didn't replace her legacy at all. You used your own 2 hands to keep it alive." Outside, Garrett walked slowly along the length of the hay wall. How high should these stones sit? He finally wondered aloud. And how far apart do you tie those knots, so a gloved hand can still find them in the dark? Silas only smiled, offering no answer of his own. Ask her. It was her design from the very first bale. A few days after the storm passed, Adelaide unlocked the north bedroom one last time and carried out Ruth's unfinished wedding blanket, placing it gently into Tahnee's 2 hands. "I don't want you to replace her name in this house. I want this blanket to go on warming the people she loved." When Adelaide finally left, for Laramie, the 2 small trunks rode back with her, empty. A week later, Silas found Tahnee standing in the same doorway where she'd first asked him for shelter, months and a lifetime ago. "I owe you far more than thanks," he began. She waited, silent. "I won't pretend Ruth was never here. She always will be, part of these walls, and always will be." His eyes swept the whole ranch before he spoke again. "But you're the reason this place is a home again. A slow breath, then more. I'm not asking you to stay because I need someone to raise my children. For the first time in many long months, a real smile reached all the way to his eyes. I'm asking you to stay because I want you standing beside me when it's time to decide what we build next. A rare, warm smile broke fully across Tahnee's face. You still have a habit of waiting until something's broken before you fix it, she teased gently. Then her eyes turned serious, though they never lost their warmth. I'm not staying just to patch things up, Silas. I'm staying so the two of us can build something that lasts. One glance around the home that had become hers too, before the rest came softly. Besides, I unpacked my travel bag a long time ago. Spring finally reached Stone Creek. Snow melted away from the hay wall at last. The damp bales hauled off, the sound ones finding new life as bedding for the barn. Garrett helped stretch a second guide rope out toward the well that spring, never once mentioning the jokes he used to make about the first one. On the porch where she'd first asked for shelter, Tahnee married Silas before the last frost had fully left the ground, in a small ceremony lit by lanterns and ringed by the whole valley that had once mocked her. Reuben, Garrett, Adelaide among them. Ruth's wedding blanket, its last unstitched inch closed by Tahnee's own hand, that winter lay across her shoulders in place of a veil. In the garden after, she planted the seed potatoes, protected all winter long, Caleb and Josephine patting the loose soil beside her with small hands. Lifting Josephine up out of the muddy row, Tahnee felt a single word whispered against her cheek. Ma! It might have been a real word. It might have only been a sound a child makes without meaning to. Silas heard it from across the garden and never once corrected her. Stone Creek Ranch entered another growing season not untouched by loss, not free of hard work still waiting to be done, but no longer living one single day at a time, no longer wondering whose name belonged on the door. Reuben stayed on through that spring and every spring after, teaching Caleb to sit a saddle before the boy could properly spell his own name. Garrett rode over most Sundays now, not to mock a hay wall or a length of rope, but to sit at a table that had somehow found room for one more chair. Adelaide wrote from Laramie every few weeks, and twice that first summer she came back to Stone Creek, simply to sit on the porch and watch her grandchildren chase chickens across a yard her daughter had once tended, satisfied in a way grief alone had never let her be. The north bedroom stayed open now, aired and swept, holding nothing anyone needed to lock away. Wisdom was never proven by surviving the easy seasons. It was proven, every time, by what still stood after the storm had passed, and by who was left standing beside you when it had.